The history of horror movies, a complete timeline. And from the flickering shadows of the silent era to the found footage nightmares of today, one question has always haunted us. What are we afraid of? This is the story of how that fear has evolved on screen, a complete timeline of the horror movie. Fear is primal. It's in our DNA. And for over a century, filmmakers have been experimenting with it, perfecting it, and throwing it right back at us from the silver screen. But the ghouls and ghosts that terrified our great-grandparents are not the same things that keep us up at night. The story of horror is really the story of us, our anxieties, our taboos, and our deepest, darkest secrets. So, turn off the lights, lock the doors. We're going back to where it all began. Section 1. The Birth of Fear, 1890s-1920s. Before horror was even the word for it, the genre existed in short, brilliant bursts of movie magic. The very first horror films showed up not long after the invention of the motion picture itself. The one that's most often cited as the first is Georges Méliès' 1896 short Le Manoir du Diable, or The House of the Devil. This 3-minute film was a spectacle of stage tricks, with transforming bats, animated skeletons, and a conjured demon. Its main goal wasn't to terrify, but to amaze audiences with the new magic of cinema. Still, it accidentally laid the cornerstone for a genre built on the supernatural. Early on, filmmakers with a taste for the macabre turned to classic literature. In the 1910s, the first screen adaptations of stories like Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde flickered to life, translating Gothic nightmares into a new visual language. But it was in post-World War I Germany that horror truly found its artistic soul. The German Expressionist movement gave birth to films that looked and felt like waking nightmares. The movement's most vital films, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920 and Nosferatu from 1922, introduced visuals that would define horror for decades. Caligari used distorted, painted sets with sharp, impossible angles to create a world of psychological distress, reflecting a society grappling with the trauma of war. Its story of a mysterious doctor and his sleepwalking murderer is one of the earliest psychological thrillers. Then came Nosferatu, an unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Director F.W. Murnau couldn't get the rights, so he changed the name and a few details, but the terrifying essence of the vampire was all there. With his rat-like features and long creeping fingers, Max Schreck's Count Orlok was a creature of pure pestilence and shadow, a far cry from the suave nobleman Stoker imagined. These German films, with their heavy makeup and ominous atmosphere, created a visual language for dread that would be imported directly to Hollywood, setting the stage for the first true age of monsters. Section 2. The Golden Age of Monsters, 1930s, 1940s. The arrival of sound in the late 1920s was a revolution for movies, and for horror it was a game-changer. Suddenly you could not only see the monster, you could hear its footsteps, its growl, and the screams of its victims. The word horror became the go-to term for the genre, and one studio in particular would become its master: Universal Pictures. Universal kicked off its legendary monster cycle in 1931 with Dracula and Frankenstein. These films defined the monsters for generations. Bela Lugosi's hypnotic performance as Count Dracula, with his iconic cape and thick Hungarian accent, established the vampire as an aristocratic, seductive predator. Just months later, Boris Karloff gave a heartbreaking performance as Frankenstein's monster. Under layers of now-famous makeup, Karloff portrayed the creature not as a simple beast, but as a tragic, misunderstood outsider, earning sympathy from audiences even as he terrified them. The success was immediate. Universal quickly built a stable of creatures that became cultural icons: the Mummy in 1932, the Invisible Man in 1933, and the Wolfman in 1941. This was the golden age of monster movies. The studio even created a connected universe decades before that was a thing, with monsters crossing over in films like Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. These weren't just movies. They were modern myths, tapping into primal fears of death, the unnatural, and the monster that lurks within us all. But as the 1940s wore on, the restrictive production code forced filmmakers to get more creative. At RKO Pictures, producer Val Lewton pioneered a different kind of horror, one built on atmosphere and suggestion. In films like 1942's Cat People, the terror was in the shadows, in what you didn't see. This psychological approach, focusing on suspense over shock, proved that sometimes the most terrifying monster is the one in your head. Section 3. Atomic Anxieties and New Blood, 1950s-1960s. As the world entered the Cold War and the Atomic Age, our fears shifted. Gothic castles felt a world away. The new threat was unseen, radiating from the sky or invading our very homes. In the 1950s, horror merged with science fiction, reflecting widespread anxiety about nuclear war and communist infiltration. The monster was no longer a creature of folklore, but a product of our own destructive science. The most potent symbol of this new fear rose from the depths in Japan. 1954's Godzilla was a direct response to the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The monster was a walking, city-destroying metaphor for the atomic bomb. In America, the fear was more insidious. Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1956 gave us aliens who replaced humans with emotionless duplicates, a terrifying allegory for the loss of individuality feared during the McCarthy era. Giant ants mutated by radiation in them, and a gelatinous blob terrorized small towns, proving that horror could now be found in our own backyards. Meanwhile, a small British studio was about to inject new life, and a lot of new blood, into the classic monsters. Their 1957 film The Curse of Frankenstein and 1958's Dracula were lush, gothic, and way more explicit than what came before. Christopher Lee's Dracula was aristocratic like Lugosi's, but he was also feral and overtly sexual, while Peter Cushing became the definitive monster hunter, Van Helsing. Hammer's films were stylish and shocking, proving audiences were still hungry for classic horror, just with more bite. But as the 60s dawned, the rules were about to be shattered completely. Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense, unleashed Psycho in 1960. The film broke every rule. It killed off its star in the first act, and its monster wasn't a vampire or a werewolf, it was the quiet man running the motel next door. Psycho moved horror out of the realm of fantasy and into a disturbingly mundane reality. A few years later, with The Birds, Hitchcock showed that terror could come from the most ordinary places. The decade closed with a film that would redraw the map of horror once again. In 1968, George A. Romero's independent black-and-white feature, Night of the Living Dead, was released. Made on a shoestring budget, its depiction of flesh-eating ghouls was more graphic than anything audiences had ever seen. But more importantly, these zombies were a tool for sharp social commentary on race, conformity, and a society tearing itself apart, a trend that would define the next era of horror. Section 4. A New Wave of Terror, 1970s. The 1970s were a decade of social upheaval, political disillusionment, and a loss of faith in authority. Horror cinema reflected that darkness perfectly. The old production code was gone, opening the floodgates for filmmakers to explore violence, sex, and religion with a newfound, terrifying freedom. This was the era where horror got serious and seriously scary. Supernatural horror dominated the box office. William Friedkin's The Exorcist in 1973 wasn't just a movie, it was a cultural event. It explored demonic possession with such visceral realism that people reportedly fainted in theaters. It treated evil not as fantasy, but as a real force that could invade a suburban home and corrupt an innocent child. This occult revival continued with films like The Omen in 1976, which centered on the ultimate evil kid, the Antichrist. At the same time, a new master of literary horror was making his mark, Stephen King. The 1976 adaptation of his debut novel, Carrie, blended supernatural terror with a heartbreaking story of teen cruelty and trauma. This was followed by Stanley Kubrick's masterful take on The Shining in 1980, a film that used psychological dread and chilling isolation to explore a family breaking down. But maybe the biggest development of the 70s was the birth of a brutal new subgenre, the slasher. While Psycho was its clear ancestor, Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974 took the human monster to a grimy, sweat-soaked, and unbearably intense new level. The film's raw documentary style made the violence feel disturbingly real. Then, in 1978, John Carpenter perfected the formula with Halloween. With its relentless killer Michael Myers, its unforgettable score, and its final girl trope, Halloween created the blueprint that would launch 1,000 imitations. Section 5. The Slasher Boom and Franchise Fever, 1980s, 1990s. If the 70s lit the fuse for the slasher film, the 1980s was the explosion. The genre became a box office juggernaut, defined by a simple, repeatable formula: a group of teens, an isolated spot, and a masked killer. The success of Halloween led directly to Friday the 13th in 1980, which introduced the world to Camp Crystal Lake and its vengeful killer, Jason Voorhees, or technically his mum in the first film. It was a massive hit and spawned one of horror's most enduring franchises. The decade gave us a new pantheon of horror icons to rival the Universal monsters. You had Jason with his hockey mask, but the most creative addition was Freddy Krueger from Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street. Freddy was a supernatural slasher who hunted you in your dreams, blurring the line between nightmare and reality. These characters weren't just villains, they were celebrities. Their faces were on lunchboxes and action figures as their films pumped out sequel after sequel, dominating the VHS market. But by the end of the decade, the formula was wearing thin. Audiences were getting tired of the predictable plots. The genre desperately needed fresh blood. Just as slashers faded, sophisticated psychological horror made a comeback. The 1991 film The Silence of the Lambs was a sensation, and it did something almost unthinkable for a horror film. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Then in 1996, the slasher was resurrected in the most unexpected way. Wes Craven, the creator of Freddy, directed Scream. This wasn't just another slasher, it was a meta-slasher. Its characters knew the rules of horror movies and talked about them while trying to survive. Scream revitalized the genre by taking it apart, cleverly playing with the tropes while still delivering genuine scares. It was witty, self-aware, and proved that even old formulas could be terrifying again if you were smart enough. Section 6. The Modern Age of Fear, 2000s present. As the new millennium dawned, horror once again fractured and evolved, reflecting the anxieties of a hyper-connected, post-9/11 world. One of the first big trends was the rise of J-horror remakes like The Ring in 2002 and The Grudge in 2004, which brought a slow-burn psychological dread to Western audiences. At the same time, the rise of digital tech gave birth to the found footage subgenre. While The Blair Witch Project had shown the world what was possible in 1999, films like Paranormal Activity perfected the formula for a new generation, creating a terrifying sense of realism. And franchises like Saw and Hostel, part of a subgenre controversially dubbed torture porn, reflected a post-9/11 anxiety about bodily harm and extreme suffering. But in the last decade, there's been another big shift. A new wave of horror, sometimes labeled elevated or art house horror, has brought the genre major critical acclaim. These films often prioritize psychological terror over jump scares, using horror to explore complex human experiences. Filmmakers like Ari Aster and Robert Eggers have become modern masters. Aster's films Hereditary and Midsommar use supernatural and folk horror to tell devastating stories about grief and family trauma. Robert Eggers' The Witch is a slow-burn nightmare about religious fanaticism in Puritan New England. And Jordan Peele has redefined the genre with Get Out and Us, using horror as a powerful tool for social commentary on racism and class. Modern horror is more diverse than ever. It includes everything from supernatural blockbusters like the Conjuring series to quiet, compassionate explorations of mental health like The Babadook and dementia in Relic. The monster is no longer just a creature in the closet. It's the trauma we inherit, the societal ills we ignore, and the darkness we carry inside ourselves. The history of horror is a vast and bloody tapestry, and we've only scratched the surface. From German expressionism to the slasher boom to the psychological horror of today, every era has its own unique fears. So, what about you? What's your favorite era of horror? What was the first movie that truly terrified you? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into film history, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Conclusion. Over more than a century, horror has evolved from simple camera tricks to complex psychological dramas. It's been dismissed as lowbrow and celebrated as high art. It has reflected our fears of the unknown, of science, of each other, and ultimately, of ourselves. The monster has changed its shape many times, from a shadowy vampire to a masked killer to a manifestation of grief, but its purpose has stayed the same: to hold a dark mirror up to our world and ask what we see. The genre continues to innovate, always finding new ways to get under our skin. And as long as there are things in the dark that make us afraid, there will be filmmakers ready to put that fear on screen. Because as one of horror's greatest minds once said, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. And that's a story that's not ending anytime soon.